Welcome to the Jefferson Council webinar series. I am Sam Richardson, the Executive Director of the Jefferson Council, and our guest today is Scott Johnston, author of Campusland. He's a cultural commentator, veteran of multiple careers, actually, including a quantitative hedge fund. He co-founded 2 technology companies, as well as 2 New York nightclubs and a restaurant. So he's got every area of the world covered. He graduated from Yale, later taught as an adjunct professor, so he knows the academy. For over 20 years, Scott has maintained a blog called The Naked Dollar. We're going to talk about that later. Has a wide range, but typically a heavy focus on educational issues. In 2019, he was compelled by incidents that he will discuss to write a novel about the ideological madness he saw in higher education. The result of that, Campusland received a very high rating on Amazon and is also being developed for a television series. His second novel, All the Lovely People, was also being published by St. Martin's Press, will be out next spring. Looking forward to that. Scott and his wife Kelly moved to Charlottesville from New York in 2021. Welcome, Scott, to the webinar and to our attendees. We ask that you please do ask questions. We are going to have a special time for Q&A, and you please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will sort through those and get to as many as we possibly can. And so right off the bat, Scott, tell us about Campusland. Those who have read, those who have yet to read it, how'd you come up with the concept? What's the backstory here?
I had no notion whatsoever to write a novel. I wasn't a writer, wasn't a fiction writer. There were 2 incidents that happened, and both on my old campus at Yale. The first was I attended a seminar, and it was actually more of a all-day symposium on the future of free speech on Yale's campus. Not sponsored by Yale. That's not the sort of thing they dig these days. But it was a fairly well-attended conference, but 200 students showed up and tried to physically shut the conference down. There was a speaker there they didn't like, and the irony that they were using their free speech rights to shut down a conference on the future of free speech was evidently lost on them. And I remember walking out through this phalanx of angry students hurling epithets and spitballs in our direction. I was walking next to the journalist Roger Kimball, and I remember saying to him, why isn't anybody using all this insanity? And this was a few years ago, but things were getting insane then. Why isn't anybody using this for, sort of grist for a good comedic novel? And it did not occur to me that I would be the person who would do something like that. But then fast forward a few months to my reunion, and I was holding a door open one evening for an undergraduate, and she refused to go through the door and accused me of patriarchy. And we had this amusing little standoff for neither of us who walked through the door. And I thought, okay, no one else seems to be writing this novel. I'm going to figure out how to write a novel. And so that produced this, and it got to number 15 on Amazon. So it's been kind of a fun journey. And now I have a new book coming out in the spring. It's actually, the title's been changed from All the Lovely People to The Sandersons Fail Manhattan. My publisher thought that was a more marketable title. So anyway, that's how Campusland came to be, and it's been great fun, kind of a later life new project.
Wow, so it sounds like the unexpected took you into an unexpected part of life, which has brought you to the forefront of contemporary political commentary and satire.
It has, and what bothered me is that nobody on the right was fighting the culture wars on the level of culture. And satire is a very effective tool for changing minds. It makes something go down easy. I've had many liberal people who've read Campusland and loved it. And so even though I don't agree with you, I liked your book. Because it's fun to read, but while they're reading it, they're going to be hopefully internalizing a few lessons.
Right. And I appreciate that you are able to bring in people from diverse viewpoints, because one of the pillar foundational principles of the Jefferson Council is discourse among disparate viewpoints, civil discourse, so that we can talk about something, learn from each other, and not just get mad and take our cookies and go home. So thank you very much for providing that to the world. That's wonderful. But my second question is, how did we get here? How did we move for a place, as a primarily an alumni organization, members of the Jefferson Council look back on their time at UVA on grounds and they compare it to what they see today, and it's a completely different culture, ethos, administration, student relationship, faculty student relationship. Can you summarize for us what happened over the past couple decades?
So it goes back further than that. And I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest version of the Reader's Digest version of this, because I've become a bit of a student of protest culture, because that's what we have now, sort of a permanent protest. And the question is why? Where did it come from? For the origins, you'd have to go all the way back to Marx. And I'll make this very brief, as brief as I can. You'd have to go all the way back to Marx, who said the proletariat should rise up and seize the means of production. Well, the problem was they didn't, and that was very frustrating to all the European Marxists. Marxism did take over in a couple of places like Russia, but it did so by the means of a coup from the elites. It wasn't the workers rising up. The elites called themselves the vanguard of the workers. So fast forward to the 1920s, and you get the head of the Italian Marxist Communist Party named Antonio Gramsci, and he said, well, really, this thing with the workers isn't working, so we need another strategy. And really, all the power seems to come from society's institutions, and they're the ones that control the culture, the media and the educational institutions and the corporations. And so we need to take over those. And it was dubbed the Long March through the institutions. And it's been very successful, and it was, especially of late, if you've followed the politics of any of our NGOs or universities or anything else. But then you get to the 1930s, and you get a group in Germany. They called themselves the Frankfurt School, and they came up with the whole idea of something they called it critical theory. Now, you ask 1,000 people what critical theory is, and 990 will have no idea. And the other 10 will give you 10 completely different answers. But the one consistent fact behind what critical theory means is that there's no such thing as objective truth. That truth is just a construct that's created by those that have the power. So really, this is adding a lot of power to Gramsci's argument, because you want to be, if the truth comes from power, then you want to control all those institutions. And we're going to fast forward again to the 1960s. You have these theories gaining incredible credence on campuses. And then in the 70s, along comes a professor at Harvard Law School named Derek Bell. And he had the very bright idea to inject the word race into critical theory, critical race theory. And in this take, it's the white people that have controlled the entire narrative of America's history. And they've done it in such a way as to oppress Black people. Now, if you believe, and this then got really turbocharged with George Floyd more recently in 2020. Now, if you believe in critical theory and critical race theory, you have a very shorthand way to hate everything about the United States and its founding and its principles, because everyone who was involved with that was essentially a dead white European. So therefore, you have a shorthand way to dismiss all of our principles that were founded from the principles of the Enlightenment. And then the answer becomes tear it all down. If we are an inherently racist and evil society and country, then the answer is tear it down, tear down our laws and institutions. And that's where you get that's where it ties in today's and what I call the permanent protest. And the key takeaway here is it's never about the nominal issue. It's not about a 1 degree change in our climate. It's not about protecting the rights of 15-year-olds to change their gender without their parents knowing. It's not about Gaza. I mean, these kids have no idea about the history of Israel and Gaza, none whatsoever. A dozen years ago, Occupy Wall Street, it wasn't about the failure of structured mortgage products. It's never the nominal issue. It's the revolution is the point, and the point is to tear down Western civilization. And that's why you can't really compromise with this crowd, because they will always move the goalposts and there'll always be a different issue. And if it's not Gaza next year, it'll be something else. We don't know what, but it'll be something. Anyway, that's the brief version.
Excellent. And maybe we can talk you into doing a longer educational piece to move us through. As a sociologist, I remember having these interesting conversations about Gramsci in grad school, and being told that this is the future and that I should get on board. Well, of course, I didn't. And so you and I are having this great conversation about looking to the future, especially the immediate future. And you said, if the topic isn't Gaza, is going to be something else. How do you see on UVA grounds, on various campuses across the country this fall, is it going to be the same issue that was instituted after October 7th last year? Or is it going to be something new that will give different traction and bring along different groups of people?
Well, that second part, you can never be entirely sure what it's going to be. I think initially it's definitely going to be Gaza, because you have October 7th is not far away. It's just a few weeks away. So we have the backdrop of the anniversary of October 7th. We also have the presidential election. So this is going to set up a lot of fireworks on campus. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, because there are all these new rules being put in place by universities all across the country. And UVA specifically, Jason Miyares, the Attorney General of Virginia, has asked all the public universities to get back to him with what their plans are specifically to deal with these protests. UVA has been a little late in responding. I believe there's going to be a board meeting tomorrow to discuss it. VCU responded 3 weeks ago. And there's going to be a bunch of rules. And those rules, for instance, there's going to be a rule, I believe, against masking if you're at a protest. Well, except there has to be an exemption for medical purposes or religious purposes. Well, then they'll just all wear keffiyehs. But the catch is they're going to have to carry ID. If you have a mask, you're going to be required to have an ID. So how's that going to work? Who's going to walk up to someone in a keffiyeh and say, "May I see your ID?" And will the person who's asked actually produce their ID? So what happens when they don't? And here you have the critical issue is rules mean nothing if they're not enforced. And nothing was enforced last year. Harvard actually said they weren't going to give diplomas to a handful of their worst transgressors. And they walked that back. They ended up quietly, when no one was paying attention, actually giving them diplomas to those students. So you can guarantee that the protest movement here is going to find out if and where a line is drawn. And they're going to keep pushing the boundaries of this until they find where that line is. And there may be no line at all, because, well, if there's one thing we've learned about campus administrators over the last couple of years, is that they had their spines all surgically removed.
That is accurate, yes. And for those interested, you can find on the Jefferson Council page at YouTube some recordings of the various meetings from university leadership that have a lot of words and said nothing. We encourage people to go and take a look at those videos. So how should students prepare? Those students who want to actually get an education, how should they prepare for the unknown on grounds where their professor may be a member of faculty for Palestine and encourage them to leave class, where their roommate may be wearing a keffiyeh and expect them to toe the ideological line or be excluded socially. Any advice for those students?
There is, by the way, there's been a nationwide call for a strike
Yes.
from a group called the Students, Young Democratic Socialists of America, which is the younger arm of all the AOC people. I think it's funny that they think they're damaging anyone but themselves by skipping class. And this is one of the things that's going to be a test, because when you miss a bunch of classes, you're supposed to fail that class. So will those professors actually fail the students? I'm going with probably not. So how to deal with this? For starters, don't back down. I wouldn't go out of your way to engage these people because they're a little crazy and they don't want to hear your reasoned arguments. It's just not going to work. But that doesn't mean you have to completely change your habits. I wouldn't change the direction you walk to your class if there's a protest going on. I wouldn't skip class just because a bunch of other people are pressuring you to skip class. That's terrible. If you're Jewish, I would, wear your yarmulke and your Star of David. And if you do end up getting in any confrontations of any kind, document it because you're more than likely going to need it. And the people that adjudicate these things won't be inclined to accept your point of view if there's no proof.
Right. Good advice. Also, I'd like to point out, Jefferson Council, we have a brand new website coming up by September, and there will be an incident report form available for students, parents, faculty, anyone who has difficulty on grounds in any way. Please feel free to let us know, and we will use as much careful processes as possible to protect your identity, as well as to do an investigation and help you work through those difficult issues that God willing won't come up. But if they do, we want to everybody know we've got your back for those who actually want to get an education and have a good experience on ground.
Hey, Sam, the other thing I'd say
Yes.
is there are a lot of student groups and groups within UVA that are trying to promote civil discourse, and it's worth engaging with them. I mean, there's one called Think Again, which is run by Mary Kate Carey, who's a great adjunct professor. And by the way, she's also teaching a course with someone named Jennifer Lawless. Mary Kate's on the right, Jennifer's on the left, and it's a course about this presidential election.
Right.
And I think that's great. I think at Dartmouth, they've sort of pioneered this idea of co-teaching, where you have both sides represented by your professors, which I think is great. There's also the Blue Ridge Center, where they sponsor a lot of great speakers. There's a group coming in called Braver Angels, which is going to, I believe, sponsor a debate. So we have to move beyond cancel culture and into, back to civil culture.
Totally agreed. And Jefferson Council is in partnership with all those organizations you mentioned. Thank you very much for that. And there will be links to those other organizations in the show notes when the recording is posted. So feel free to visit our partner organizations. But you mentioned the presidential election coming up first week in November. How could that figure in positive ways as well as potential negative ways? And in your view, does Students for Justice in Palestine, Social Democrats, do they have a supporter in Vice President Harris, or is that a non-starter?
Well, if you've got President Harris behind closed doors, where she wasn't being overheard, yes, absolutely, she's their supporter. And they've been trying to do this little dance where they are trying not to offend either side. Because most Jews vote Democrat, so there's that group they have to worry about. But on the other hand, they've got to win the state of Michigan also, and there's a significant Muslim population in Michigan, so they're trying to do a little careful dance. And you won't hear Kamala Harris talk about this issue if she can manage it at all between now and the presidential election. I can't see much happiness coming out of this whole situation on campuses. If Trump wins, there'll be insanity, just like there was last time. I think at Yale, they all went out at 3 a.m, did a primal scream in the quad. So you'll hear primal screams all across the land. If Harris wins, that won't happen. But God help us policy-wise.
Right. I can't disagree with you there. So let's take a little bit of a positive pivot and tell us about your new book, The Sanderson Tale. I do have a wonderful blurb from Christopher Buckley. He wrote about The Sanderson Tale. Scott Johnston is the sharpest and most fun to read satirical novelist writing today. Following on his brilliant debut novel, Campusland, he now turns his attention to Manhattan's ever so Upper East Side in a laugh out loud mashup of Bonfire of the Vanities and Mean Girls. This is DEI at its best: delicious, entertaining, intelligent. Did I mention fun? Great fun. Hey, Christopher Buckley, that sounds like a great endorsement. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, he was kind of a dream get for a blurb. Little inside baseball in the publishing industry. That's what they hate the most, trying to get blurbs, because you have to try and convince somebody famous to read your book. And if you're a new novelist, like, they're just not going to make the time. So this was actually kind of wonderful that he took. He read it in 2 days, I'm told. It's a bit like Campusland, except the setting is the Upper East Side, and the focus is on an all-girls elite private school where they get their first trans student. And that student disappears, and the entire city goes a little crazy trying to find her. And it's meant to be great fun. I have a cast of great characters, including at least one ecosexual, and that is just what it sounds like.
Okay. Any characters that are held over from Campusland into the new book?
No, a lot of thematic overlap. My alma mater gets a fair bit of treatment, just like it did in Campusland.
Okay.
Although in Campusland, I called it something. I didn't call it Yale.
Right.
But no character carryover.
Well, I did read the chapter that is available at your blog at nakeddollar.blogspot.com. And please, everybody within listening distance, go to nakeddollar.blogspot.com and scroll down and find that chapter of the new book. It is well worth the read. But that brings us into the area of writing a novel, a satirical novel. What's your process? How do you sit down and write a novel?
I had no idea at first. I Googled how do you write a novel, and I tried the whole thing where you have a file card for each chapter and you post them on a big board and work out the whole novel and then start writing. And that turned out to be absolutely impossible. So I just start writing. I have an idea of who I want to skewer, and I have a couple characters in mind, and I start writing the first few chapters, and I kind of just hope the rest of it will come.
Okay, and it does.
It takes some mental grinding, and it's satisfying when it falls together. And sometimes a plot twist will occur to you 3/4 of the way through the book, and then you've got to go back and seed it so it works. And I call it lurching and iterating.
Very descriptive. Okay. Well, I want to let everybody know that you are available for book tours, guest spots, podcasts, to talk about your writing process and your satirical commentary on our culture. And thank you very much for sharing that. Let's move to some questions in our queue. Tom asks, how can we restore true intellectual diversity and civil dialogue on our campuses, given the pervasive academic administration's woke culture that does not tolerate moderate and conservative voices?
There's no simple answer to that one. Faculties are well, 95% left wing now. That's not exaggeration. I think at Yale, there was in the last 2 or 3 election cycles, there's been exactly one professor, a computer science professor, who's donated any money to any Republican anywhere. So this is a decades-long project to try and fix these schools. And it's a legitimate question whether they can be fixed at all, whether the cancer is so deep, or whether you just need to start over, like this new University of Austin, for instance. Right. And I'm torn. You know, I love the Yale that I went to. I think UVA is a wonderful place. I think at Yale, I don't know that Yale can be fixed. UVA can possibly be fixed, and that's a function of being a public university and its board being appointed by the governor. So there is the possibility that UVA and UNC has taken some very positive steps towards fixing what ails academia. And if prominent schools like UVA and UNC can set an example, maybe that reverberates outward. But I can tell you the boards at the Ivy League school, that's an inside rigged game. I've known some of these board members. If you're a huge giver, you might get a spot briefly, but after your 4-year term is up, you're not asked back. And somehow the left-wing corporate guy to your left on the board table, somehow he does get asked back. It's a completely rigged game, and I'm not optimistic there.
So maybe it is up to the new Ivies to make the change. And along those lines, actually, one of my neighbors who is going to be a first year at the University of Chicago in just a couple of weeks, he read your book and asked a very interesting question. He says, is it possible, or maybe inherently impossible, for higher ed institutions to have an overall goal outside of educating students to promote social change in a way that would not be political charged? In other words, how should universities go about educating their students in a way that does not attempt to indoctrinate them?
Well, somehow in the last few years, the goal of universities has changed. The goal used to be the pursuit of truth. And now the really overt goal is social justice. And we've got to go back to what it was, because if the goal is social justice, well, whose idea, like whose concept of social justice is it? Well, it's a bunch of administrators and professors. That's indoctrination. When the goal was the pursuit of truth, you know, our universities were all founded on the principles of the Enlightenment, and they weren't conservative per se. But they were dedicated to just finding the truth, and wherever the truth takes you is where it takes you. So we have to go back. Chicago, congratulations on getting into Chicago. They're better than most, and they actually have very good free speech principles that are largely enforced. Yale has wonderful free speech principles, but they're not enforced, so they're meaningless. So I think we need to go back in time. I don't want to sound retrograde, but that's what we need to do.
That makes sense. Thank you for that. A couple of quick questions in closing. One from your friend of mine, Virginia Sanandala. She wants to know a question that a lot of people are asking. Are the 10 Commandments still taught and still relevant? And if the answer is no, which we often presume, how do students today develop a sense of right and wrong, or do they?
Well, if you taught the 10 Commandments at most universities today, you'd be frog marched off campus. The Christianity is nowhere to be found on the ladder of oppression. In fact, they're the oppressors. So that I don't know that the 10 Commandments have been taught in a century on U.S. campuses. As for where people should be getting their values from, mostly their families. I think it's a university's job to teach you how to think. You know, it's kind of a cliche, teach people how to think, not what to think. And hopefully in teaching people how to think, they come to ethical and moral conclusions. But I think that the main onus is on families to be teaching people how to be good citizens.
Which is a huge social and sociological cultural question, which the Jefferson Council may get into that area in the near future. Final question, and this is from Stu, and this actually takes us back to your blog and a recent blog post you made at thenakeddollar.blogspot.com. Something apparent in Campusland is that there is a appreciation for aesthetics when it comes to architecture on campus. Are universities waging a war on art and beauty today?
Yes. So this was an interesting piece to think through and write. I started thinking about it when there's the whole body positivity movement, which basically celebrates obesity, and obesity is dangerous. But we've all seen the Gatorade ads with the obese people doing yoga poses, and the woman from UVA, the activist, was hired, who weighs 300 pounds, was hired to be I think, an influencer for Dove beauty bars. But it's more than just the aesthetics of people. It gets into things like art and architecture. And a great example is the public library in Boston, which the original public library, built in the 1890s, is a gorgeous sort of Italian Renaissance structure. And then Philip Johnston, the famed architect, built an annex to it that is basically a block of concrete. It's a brutalist monster. And one can see this in many different things. If you look at my blog post, I compare a lamp post from 100 years ago versus a lamp post today, and a drinking fountain, and all sorts of things where we don't seem to embrace beauty anymore. And there is a political agenda behind this. It's kind of like it's a bit like a branch of critical theory called critical aesthetic theory. And because if you say something is beautiful, you're implicitly saying that other things aren't beautiful, and that's being judgmental, and you're not supposed to be judgmental.
Right. Excellent. And please go out and read that piece of Scott's at his blog. And I would like to ask one more question, because I think it brings us back into the entire culture milieu of the issues going on campus that Jefferson Council is doing its best to address with UVA on grounds and leadership. And that is a question from Matt, who makes the observation that Fortune 500 companies, Harley Davidson, I heard just today, is walking back their DEI office. We've heard the same from Google. We've heard it from Tractor Supply. Is this an indication of the passing social import of DEI and other progressive leftist ideologies? Or is this not going to have any impact in the academy, and they're going to do what they're going to do come hell or high water?
Well, some people talk about the concept of peak woke, and that peak woke was 2020, 2021. So the Black Lives Matter summer and all that. While it was certainly the most in your face during that period, don't buy into this. It's all going away. It's just a pendulum that's swinging back the other direction. There have been a few victories on the corporate front with consumers exercising some muscle. I think Bud Light is the most obvious example of that. But these things are few and far between, and DEI is so thoroughly embedded in corporate America now, and our university system as well, of course, and really in all institutions. Just look what's happened to the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation is a radical left organization founded by the very conservative Ford family. So the Long March has been very successful. So this is a multi-generational cultural fight, and I get a little upset when people think, okay, well, it's the tide's turning, and it'll all be okay, because it won't. And honestly, if Kamala Harris wins, they're going to turbocharge DEI concepts at the federal level, the way Biden has been as well, in the military and so forth. And we'll be unable to fight a war.
My contacts in the military tell me the same thing. Scott, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you so very much for being with us here today. I want to remind everybody that they can reach out to Scott at his blog, thenakeddollar.blogspot.com. You can reach him via email at scott.c.johnston@gmail.com. This will also be in the show notes, and you can catch a recording of this session at thejeffersoncouncil.com as well as on YouTube. And please look forward to our upcoming webinars and podcasts starting in September. Thanks again, Scott. Have a great rest of the week, and may heaven bring relief to us all.